you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here's the video that you came here for, and really do a little bit of a follow-up on a story that we discussed last week on the Aaron Torres pod. It involves a five-star quarterback by the name of Jaden Rashada. And I want to move this story forward, but let me just give you the quick 1 minute, everything you need to know up until this point so we can again move this story forward. But this was the kid with the crazy recruitment, the crazy NIL. If you remember, back in June, we actually discussed him, was a Florida lean, takes a visit to Miami at the last second, ends up committing to Miami. Florida fans are freaking out. What does it all mean? Well, he stays committed to Miami through about late October, early November, decides to decommit to Florida, and that's where we think it ends. Decommits from Miami, commits to Florida. Oh my goodness, the Gators got their guy. Celebration in the streets of Gainesville. Just one problem. National Signing Day comes. Billy Napier's press conference is postponed. This kid might not sign. Even after he signs, a week ago when it was time to move into the dorms at Florida, we find out that Jaden Rashada will not move in. And at that point, the question became, well, why is this kind of low 5-star, high 4-star quarterback? Like, why isn't he going to Florida? He was committed. He signed his letter of intent. He went through the high school circuit. He was doing the Gator Chomp and all these high school events. And we find out that this is the first case of an NIL deal very publicly going wrong. The details, listen, you can like NIL, you cannot like NIL, but the Florida Gators collectives agreed to a certain number with Jaden Rashada. The reports are up to $13 million. Now, I don't think it was $13 million guaranteed, but I think if everything went right, if he won the starting job, won the SEC, competed for national titles, he could have made up to $13 million over the course of his career as a Florida Gator. But as he's getting set to go to campus, Florida basically pulls the offer from him or basically wants to renegotiate on the fly. And so it's this crazy, chaotic thing. I think it's a disaster for Florida. But late last week, they did, in fact, let him out of his letter of intent. And so because of it, he is now, if you want to use the term, he is a free agent in terms of college football recruiting. And so in my opinion, I don't think there's really much more to talk about from the Florida perspective. Listen, I think it's weird. It's disappointing. In some ways, it's sad. It's pathetic because this kid just wants to play football. And if you agreed to terms with him, you can say, is he worth it? Is he not worth it? I don't think any high school quarterback so far that I've seen is really worth $13 million. Maybe Trevor Lawrence, that's really it. But at the same time, when you agree to a deal, you got to go through with it. So it's disappointing. It's embarrassing. I'll be curious if this ends up in court somewhere. And if it does, by the way, we will obviously discuss it. But what I want to do now is kind of move the story forward because we now have a 5-star quarterback that was committed to an SEC school that is now essentially a free agent in terms of college recruiting. He's not going to Florida. That relationship is blown up. He's not going to Miami. Miami doesn't seem to be interested in recruiting him very much. And so now the question becomes, where does this kid go? As we get set for the second national signing period in February, he is obviously the most high-profile player available. And beyond that, he, of course, is the most high-profile quarterback by a mile that's available. And so over the last couple of days, we've started to get a feel for what schools might be interested. And I'll tell you, it's kind of an interesting list considering that the initial recruitment came down to Florida and Miami. Well, at this point, basically all of the major schools in college football have their quarterbacks committed. And it feels like the teams that are interested in him don't really match up with who was recruiting him early, as in addition to Florida and Miami was being recruited by LSU, A&M, Ole Miss, I believe, was in the mix, but there are still a few schools that are interested. And so let's start to get down to the nitty gritty of where he could end up, because I think this is going to be a fascinating story to follow over the next 2-3 weeks. Among the schools that we know are actively recruiting Jaden Rashada, let's get to the first two. One, the Arizona State Sun Devils. And before I get into this list, I think we need to kind of contextualize one thing. I don't think any of the schools that are currently recruiting Jaden Rashada have anything close to the money that was being offered by Florida. So when I list these schools, I don't want you to sit there and say, well, wait a second now. Florida was going to pay him $13 million. Are these schools going to try to match that? I don't believe any of these schools have anywhere near the resources or funds to match Florida. Now, keep in mind, again, Florida might have to pay him something because it's a breach of contract down there in Gainesville. But why I bring it up is because there are a bunch of schools that have been linked to him. And so let's start with them. The first one, as I said, was Arizona State. Now, to some of you might say, Arizona State, that's weird. 5-star quarterback doesn't make sense. Well, actually makes sense for a few reasons. One, I found this interesting. Jaden Rashada's dad, Harlan Rashada, who does all the interviews, he seems to be the brains behind the NIL operation, but his dad played at Arizona State back in the early 90s. Beyond that, and I think this is an important element, there is a relationship with the new head coach at Arizona State, Kenny Dillingham. For people who do not remember, Kenny Dillingham was the Oregon offensive coordinator from the state of Arizona, gets the Arizona State job. But back when he was at Oregon, he actually did recruit Jaden Rashada, who is originally from the West Coast, originally from the Bay Area. So you have the connections there. You have the ties from the father to the Pac-12. Or to Arizona State. And I also think it's worth noting the setup would be kind of nice for Jaden Rashada to potentially compete pretty early for a job there. Now, they did take Drew Pine, the transfer from Notre Dame for this year, but Drew Pine is kind of a one-year plug-and-play guy. And then after that, it's kind of wide open in terms of who could potentially be the next quarterback, and Jaden Rashada could slide in pretty well as well. What I would also kind of wrap with as far as Arizona State is concerned, I will say, the NIL situation is not going to be Florida. It's not going to be Miami. It's not going to be whoever. But the NIL situation, this was one thing that the school addressed when Kenny Dillingham got the job. Remember, there was a booster at Kenny Dillingham's opening press conference that said, I'm going to write you $1 million check right now because I believe in this program that much. And so the NIL structure at Arizona State, I believe, is starting to get much better, where you can at least offer this kid something. Now, you're not going to get Florida money. You're not going to get maybe what Miami was willing to offer, but you could potentially get some nice money as a high 4-star recruit, 5-star recruit, whatever, and then be the face of this program in year 2. But Arizona State is the one that we know is a factor. I don't even know if I mentioned this, but he reportedly visited Arizona State this weekend. And so you have to think that they're in pretty good shape early with this kid. Second team that we know is involved. Pete Thamel from ESPN reported that in addition to visiting Arizona State this past weekend, this coming weekend, Jaden Rashada and his family will visit TCU. And where TCU makes sense on a ton of different levels. First off, I mean, we all watched that offense. It was awesome. Now, take out the Georgia game. We don't have to talk about the Georgia game, but this is obviously a program on the rise, a program that has had a ton of success really in the last 20 years since the turn of the century, but seems to have hit a new level under Sonny Dykes. Okay. Obviously went 12-0 in the regular season, played for a Big 12 title, got into the college football playoff, beats Michigan. And what's most important is this is an offense that has proven the ability to create high leverage, really successful quarterbacks. Sonny Dykes, even before he got to TCU, remember, this was a guy that was at Cal. He had Jared Goff at Cal, goes to SMU, has a ton of success at SMU. Now he's at TCU. And TCU, outside of the fact that Max Duggan is now a draftable prospect, and he wasn't a year ago, they have some questions at quarterback next year going in as well. They did not take a quarterback in this transfer cycle. They do have a freshman on the roster named Chandler Morris, who won the job early in the year only to lose it to Max Duggan. But ultimately, this race is pretty wide open as far as who is going to be the next quarterback for TCU. And so again, Jaden Rashada could come in. He wouldn't have to be the savior right away. And beyond that, there's nobody that's super established that it's well, there's no way you'll never have the chance to play over him. This is not going to, I can't even think of somewhere off the top of my head. It's where they have an established, say, freshman quarterback. It's not going to Clemson where Cade Klubnik we know is the guy. So TCU makes a lot of sense. And the last thing I would say, on top of the offense, Sonny Dykes' success on the field, this is a program that my understanding is they're not afraid to dabble in NIL. So they're not going to give you, again, the money that Florida did, But they'll if you perform, they'll put you in a nice situation. TCU, I believe, is very much in the mix. He will visit there. A couple other schools that I've heard that I don't know that I totally buy. The first is Cal. Okay, Cal Berkeley. The Cal Berkeley that's getting a subsidy from UCLA. Remember, Cal, of course, is still in the Pac-12, and they agreed to take money from UCLA. They're both part of the California, the UC district, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But Cal has been linked to Jaden Rashada as well. Some of you may be wondering why. Well, Jaden Rashada is from the Bay Area, and he did initially, in his original top 7 during his initial recruitment, did have Cal in the mix. Obviously, a lot of relationships there, coaches that recruited him still there, etc. Why I don't see this is for a few reasons. One, even from the football perspective, this is a program that's really struggling. This is a program I actually feel bad. They seem to be on the rise, and then COVID hit. And as we all know, the Bay Area had, frankly, the most restrictive COVID restrictions in the country. They only got 4 games in during the 2020 season. Last year, 2 years ago, they go 5-7. This past season, they go 4-8. So they're going in the wrong direction. It's the Bay Area. And here's the thing about Cal. Not only do they not have NIL money anywhere close to a lot of other schools, I don't even think they want to get into the NIL world. Like, that's something that I've kind of heard about Cal, Stanford, schools like that. I don't know that they're comfortable just writing a check to an 18-year-old kid and saying, hey, here's some money. Let's see if you can live up to the expectations. So unless he is completely willing to eschew or give up on NIL money, I don't really think that Cal is in the mix. Could be wrong on that one. It's still early, but that one doesn't make sense to me. Washington, I think, is another one that's been linked. Obviously, they had a great first year. Kalen DeBoer, head coach, 11 wins, high-profile offense. This was the number 1 passing offense in college football. Do not forget, the number 1 passing offense in college football this year was not Tennessee, Josh Heupel, Hendon Hooker. It was not Ohio State, Ryan Day, C.J. Stroud. It was Washington with Michael Penix. And remember, Michael Penix is now going to be a 5th or 6th year senior next year. He'll be back, but his eligibility will be up. The question I have with Washington is pretty similar to Cal. Can you get into the NIL spending game? I don't know that Washington is a school. Washington is a great academic school, great support in the community, and I think they're going to take care of the guys that have success. My understanding is Michael Penix actually has a very nice NIL setup. But are they going to spend 6 figures, 7 figures to get an unproven high school quarterback? That I don't know. So they're one to keep an eye on. And then finally, I'm just going to say it. There's one more Pac-12 school that I think is at least worth discussing. And you know who it is already. That's right. I'm talking Colorado and Coach Prime. Now, is it likely? I don't know if it's likely or not. But Colorado checks a lot of boxes, okay? First off, let's just forget NIL when it comes to Colorado, okay? Because Colorado, here's how I know that their NIL right now is not in a good place. Do you remember Coach Prime, Deion Sanders' opening press conference when the AD Rick George was asked, well, Coach, we didn't think you would be able to spend that much money on a coach. How are you going to be able to afford Coach Prime's contract? Where did the money come from? And Rick George literally said, well, we don't have the money yet, but we're going to figure it out. So when the AD says we don't have the money to pay the coach, I don't think there's just, tens of millions of dollars floating around for NIL. But obviously, Coach Prime and Colorado is going to offer pretty much everything else. NFL coaching, NFL structure, NFL system. Remember, the offense that they are going to run, their offensive coordinator, Sean Lewis, was the head coach at Kent State. This was one of the most prolific offenses in college football during Sean Lewis's time at Kent State. Now, after this last year was a little bit of a struggle, whatever, but like 2 years ago, they averaged like 50 points a game. So the offense is going to be potent. Coach Prime is going to put you in position where you're going to have good players around you. One of their top 3 commitments are all either running backs or wide receivers. Amarion Miller was committed to Nebraska, 4-star, now going to Colorado. Dylan Edwards, 4-star running back, was committed to Notre Dame, now going to Colorado. They've gotten some guys out of the transfer portal. Jimmy Horn, wide receiver, AAC, South Florida, was all AAC wide receiver. Seydou Traore, all Sun Belt tight end from Arkansas State. So you got talent everywhere. It's worth noting Shedeur Sanders, Deion's son, Coach Prime's son, is draft eligible after this year. I don't know for sure what his plans are, if he'll go, if he'll stay. I think it obviously will depend on how well he plays this year, but it's not inconceivable. You come, you sit behind Shedeur, you get NFL head coaching, and then you fast forward a year from now, and it's going to be a wide open competition to get that starting quarterback spot. The only thing with Colorado, they did actually take 2 quarterbacks in the high school class. So this would now be quarterback number 3 in this high school class. But hey, it's not unprecedented, right? Ole Miss just took 2 transfer quarterbacks when they have a returning quarterback in Jackson Dart. They took Spencer Sanders, they took Walker Howard when they already have an established starter in Jackson Dart. So it's not inconceivable. And listen, if Coach Prime is going to do what I know Coach Prime is going to do, which is create a competitive environment, he's not going to just hand the job to one of these, So I think Shedeur is pretty set. But after him, I think it's pretty wide open. And I could see the scenario where Jaden Rashada ends up committing to Colorado, playing under Coach Prime, and getting better. Outside of that, I do think outside of those 5, I think it's pretty hard to gauge who's actually interested and who's not. Again, it's worth noting, most of the schools that were recruiting him originally, they've taken quarterbacks. Ole Miss was recruiting him. They took 2 quarterbacks in the transfer portal. A&M took a quarterback in the senior class. Miami took a quarterback in the senior class. So to me, those are the 5 that are worth monitoring. Arizona State, TCU, I guess you could say Cal, Washington, and Colorado. If I had to guess, I would say it's one of those 5 that he ends up committing to, and he could commit sooner rather than later. Took a visit to ASU, going to TCU next weekend. It might get to a point where he doesn't even have to go to any other school, but those are the ones that are worth following. And I'll tell you, it's fascinating. As I said, highest profile player that will sign in February, highest profile player available, period.